Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in this evening. Great to have you all back. I wanted to start off with a little success story this morning before we get into our next topic. One of our group members has recently successfully purchased a property that we placed on our forum. So we obviously showed interest and put an offer in on the property. So we're now at the point where the property's settled, and we were really grateful to be a part of that. My office assisted him with the selection of a new tenant. So within a week we were able to secure a great tenant, and we were able to achieve a 6% yield on that investment. So that was a really good success story, and it makes me feel really proud, and obviously it means that what we're doing on this forum is providing exactly what we were hoping to achieve. So congratulations to our member out there. So our topic this week is the 5 most common mistakes made by private landlords. Now, I just want to put it out there and say I'm not picking on private landlords just because I'm a property manager, and this is not a plug to obviously attract investors to make a change. It's simply some things that I've found over the years that commonly private landlords more than property managers will obviously make these mistakes. So I'm hoping that this will give you a bit of a grounding for setting up your tenancy in the right way, and also maintaining the tenancy in the right way to avoid some of those risks that we talked about in previous episodes. So, number 1. Failure to keep written records. I think one of the biggest things with private landlords is they're very trusting of the people that they're working with, which we'd all like to think that most people do the right thing, and whilst yes they do, sometimes you'll find the relationship will go along really well to a point, and that point is usually where there's a change of circumstance with the tenant in the property, and they may or may not want to play by the rules. So this is where we need to make sure that we have written documentation, that we have records. So some of those things include, and not limited to, naturally, keeping a rental ledger. It is actually a requirement that you keep a ledger or a payment history, aside from just your bank account that you use for rent deposits. So that's tracking every single payment that comes through to you from the tenant in terms of those rent payments, the paid from date and the paid to date during that entire term of that tenancy. So that's the first thing, and most importantly, obviously we're keeping records such as tenancy agreements, such as property condition reports. And I know that sounds like that's a fairly common thing, but you'd be surprised the number of people that I deal with that say, well, actually, we're in a bit of trouble. This is the situation. I haven't got a condition report, I haven't got a tenancy agreement. It was all a verbal arrangement. So I'll say to you this, that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So that's the number 1 tip that I have in regard to keeping records. The other is, and I find commonly, once again, the trust factor coming in, is that property investors tend not to do regular routine inspections of the property. They're trusting that the tenants are doing all the right things. They might do one inspection and they find that it's satisfactory, and they don't attend that regular inspection of the property. The other thing that they sometimes fail to do is actually keep a record of that inspection. Whilst you think you might not need that, if you ever have a situation where, for example, there's a discrepancy and there's damage during that tenancy and it's an ongoing issue, if you do need to go down the track of making an insurance claim, what you'll find is that most policies have in the fine print that they won't cover what's called neglect by tenant. So they may well have accidental damage and malicious damage written into the policy and you think you're safe, but if you allow something to occur over a long period of time, all of a sudden you fall into that grey area, which is called tenant neglect. So basically you're allowing the tenant to live in a certain way that over the long term is causing damage to the property. So therefore your insurance will more than likely say, well, you allowed that to happen over a period of time and you haven't provided any documentation that shows that you followed through, or you issued a breach notice during that time. So be really mindful of that. I see that happen a lot. So regular routine inspections, I know our office, we do a minimum of every 3 months, and in between, if we find that there's an issue with the tenancy, there's a discrepancy or a breach of the agreement, we will actually serve notice that we'll return within 7 days to make sure that issue is rectified within that period of time. So do follow up on things that are not quite right and make sure that you're setting that benchmark for what the expectation is. So that's number 2. Number 3 is negotiating tenancy renewals in advance. Some clients don't realise that you can actually come to an agreement with your tenant to renew the tenancy early rather than waiting until you get really close to the expiry and then trying to negotiate the terms of either a renewal or a vacate. So I would suggest contacting your tenants at least 2 months in advance to talk about what their intentions might be, whether or not they intend to renew, and also that's when you would consider whether or not you're looking at increasing the rent depending on the market at the time. So make sure you're doing that in advance for your own security, but also for the security of the tenant, and everyone's happy and you can organise that renewal nice and early. So that's my third tip. Number 4. So most common mistake, number 4, is understanding the legislation. And this is where it gets quite tricky for private owners. They think a handshake arrangement is all you need with a tenancy, but there are so many rules around renting that you need to be aware of. And the interesting fact about that is that I find most tenants are more educated than property owners. And that's because if there's something that they're dealing with at the time, they're going to get advice on it. They're going to go to the resources that they have available, the tenancy union, the tenancy commissioner, where they'll actually be given advice on a subject. And sometimes property owners don't go to the trouble of actually educating themselves around these issues before they respond to the tenant on a situation. So make sure you're across the main areas of the legislation that will impact you during that time. There are lots of resources for that, and I'll actually ask Richard, who's filming today, at the end of this post to put up some websites which will give you some information on where you can go to get obviously information on the legislation, but also I find that most clients are not going to actually sit down and read the legislation itself, which is the Residential Tenancy Act 1997. I don't think anyone's going to sit down and read that from start to finish, but there are resources that shortcut that and give you in layman's terms obviously some of the areas that you need to be aware of surrounding tenancies. So I'll give you some websites that you can go to. The next is marketing the property prior to the vacate. So if you're aware that the tenant's vacating the property in advance, which you should be because you should have been talking to them at least 2 months in advance to negotiate that renewal. So you should be aware leading up to the lease expiry whether or not they're going to be looking at staying on or whether they're going to be vacating the property. So that's at the point where you should be talking about advertising the property leading up to that property becoming vacant, rather than waiting until the tenants actually move out and then you go in and do the final inspection, you'll do some clean-up jobs in between and then you start advertising. This happens quite commonly, and it's interesting that quite often clients will question paying an agent for that service of letting a property, but they're quite happy to wear the cost of that vacancy in between, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to not want to pay an agent, say 1 or 2 weeks rent to let the property, but then you're happy for it to sit vacant for a period of time until you're ready to start advertising again for a new tenant. So that time in between is pretty critical if you can. If you don't plan on going in and doing a lot of work on the property, renovations on the property, if it's just a little bit of a tidy up before you relet the property, there's no reason why you can't start advertising for a tenant, put that tenancy in place, always allow a gap naturally, so you don't want to be finishing a lease and starting a new tenancy agreement within 1 or 2 days of that expiry. You need to allow yourself at least a week in between to make sure you've got that little bit of leeway to get those little jobs done. So there you have it, the 5 most common mistakes made by private landlords. I hope that's been helpful for you. Once again, we will place those websites up on this forum today for you to check out. So certainly more information there for you. And again, if I can assist you, if you have any questions, if you're dealing with something a little bit tricky or any of that sounds familiar to you and you'd like some advice around those areas, please get in contact either on this post or naturally you're welcome to contact me directly as well. So thank you so much for tuning in.